years between World War I and World War II, there was a kind of a lot going on in the world. There was a mixed foreign policy with regard to the United States dealing with different parts of the world. In Europe, there was a lot of discussion in Congress about $10 billion or so worth of war loans given to the Allies, and how we were going to get repaid for that, especially with the troubled economies of Europe after the war. Also, of course, the U.S. refused to join the League of Nations, which was formed after World War I, or it did not recognize the Soviet Union as a legitimate government after the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrew what the U.S. saw as was the legitimate government, the Tsar. So these were going on in Europe. In Latin America, Franklin Roosevelt made a conscious shift away from the policies of Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and even those that came before them over those Latin American policies, what we would call interventionist policies, especially after the Spanish-American War, where it just seemed like the U.S. was always interfering with Latin American politics in their countries and everything. So Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, tried to mend fences, if you will, with Latin America, and actually he called it his good neighbor policy. Considering, of course, we're neighbors with Latin America, it's good to be a good neighbor. So it was a shift from what we might call coercion, making them do what we want, to cooperation, helping them. Maybe we still want them to do what we want, but maybe try to do things that are beneficial to them in the process as well. And also, he renounced this idea of imperialism, or this idea that America was creating a Western Hemisphere empire with Latin America. And so he wanted to kind of have them rest easy that this is not going to be his policies. In Asia, Japan is becoming much more aggressive, and the U.S. is forced to kind of protect the interests of China, that open door policy that we've always had with China. Major nations agree to naval limits as throughout the world, especially in Europe, as the increase in naval size was one of the things that many people argue led to World War I. That everybody after Alfred T. Mahan's book, all these countries built these strong, shiny new navies, and they had to justify them and use them. So therefore, they were looking for reasons to maybe go to war. And there were some agreements among nations to try to limit possible future conflicts, like the Nine Power Treaty, which was among Europe and Asian nations that reaffirmed the open door policy, even though Japan was interfering with this in a lot of ways. And the Four Power Treaty, U.S., Great Britain, France, and Japan, trying to establish kind of spheres of influence to keep the peace in their parts of the country. In their parts of the world. Now, the Great Depression back home shifts U.S. focus to domestic issues. We're not as worried as we had been in the past about what's going on overseas. We revert to a not complete isolationism, but we're moving away from being involved as much as we had been before World War I, involved in world affairs. Of course, as this is happening, other European nations are doing this as well, with some nations actually focusing all their resources on building up strong nationalist attitudes and strong militaries. And with the rise of military regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan, it seems that war might be on the horizon again. And Senator Nye, I'm sorry, but I can't remember his first name, but Senator Nye introduces something called neutrality legislation, which its purpose is to keep us out of war and keep us from getting sucked into war by trading. Because if you remember, one of the things that got us drawn into World War I was that our ships that were trading with the Allies were being attacked by German submarines. So, of course, with all those loans that we had in World War I had given the and credit we had given the Allies, we still hadn't gotten paid back for that. With the combination of those two things, Nye basically proposes a law that prohibits loaning money or trading with nations at war. Now, this goes really against most American policies of the past because we took advantage of trading with nations at war because that's very profitable for the nations that are trading with those warring nations. But this law passes, and so it becomes the law of the land that we're not able to actually loan money or trade with nations at war. We're going to find ways around this when it comes to World War II or the lead up to World War II. A couple of countries that are in the midst of building up their militaries and their kind of nationalistic or nation-first attitudes. Germany under Adolf Hitler. Of course, remember World War I and the reaction of Germans to the World War I peace treaty, which basically made Germany take all the blame, forced them to pay reparations or pay the war costs of all the other nations in the war, not just Germany's. And it really, really crippled their economy. It humiliated the people of Germany. And anytime you have destitute people that have lost hope, it's very easy for somebody, a demagogue or a slick-talking person to come in and tell them what they want to hear. And basically, the things they want to hear is that it's not their fault, and that if you give me power, I will fix it. Believe me, trust me. And of course, these types of people, these demagogues that, like Hitler, they'll always blame other people. They'll always point to others and accuse them that it's their fault. Not your fault, my fellow, Aryan Germans. It's their fault. And of course, history has shown us that Hitler pointed the finger at Jews, at gypsies, at anybody, at communists, at anybody who was not, a prototypical, in Hitler's eyes at least, a prototypical German. And so he whips up a lot of hate and fear in Germany. And at the same time, he's decided that he's going to ignore the reparations, and he's going to focus all of his money of Germany and all the resources of Germany into building up the military production. In Italy, Benito Mussolini has taken power, and he is really kind of doing the same thing. He won't have the same war machine that Hitler will create, but he will, in and of itself, be powerful enough to ally himself with Germany and create his own kind of fascist, nationalist type government. And in Japan, Emperor Hirohito is, of course, the emperor, symbolically, really, the leaders of the nation, the actual people who govern, are all aggressive military leaders, and they also are building up their military power because they are pursuing a very aggressive empirical strategy in Asia. Of course, Japan is an island nation. It's a string of islands, and they don't have a lot of natural resources that are required to have a modern economy, especially oil, coal, things like that. So in order to have access to those goods, because they import most of their resources like that, and much of it from the United States, but they're seeking territories in order to secure these natural resources. And in 1937, Japan invades China. Which of course violates our open door policy to China. And Roosevelt, working with Congress, finds ways around the neutrality legislation in order to permit arms sales to China in order to hold off Japan's aggressiveness. Now, as war is getting close in Europe, and Germany is, of course, building up its military, and it's starting to threaten its neighbors. It is specifically a threat to Czechoslovakia, which basically it was a new country that consists of some of it consists of territory that was taken from Germany after World War I. And so Hitler decides and tells the rest of Europe that he's going to take it. But he promises that's all he's going to do. He's just going to take Czechoslovakia, and then he'll be done because he's owed Czechoslovakia. And while the rest of Europe, England, France, and some other countries would like to believe him, they really don't. But they don't do anything. They basically appease him, which basically that just means they let him do what he wants. And they just kind of cross their fingers and hope that he doesn't go too far. Now, once Hitler seizes Czechoslovakia, he recognizes that Hitler is a great danger. And he knows that France and Great Britain are going to have to be the ones in Europe to stop them. So he attempts to revise the Neutrality Act to, in case they officially go to war, to help Great Britain and France. Then Hitler begins threatening Poland and Great Britain, England, and Winston Churchill tell Hitler that, okay, we've let you take Czechoslovakia, we've let you kind of be a bully, but now if you invade Poland, we're going to declare war on you. And in September 1939, Hitler invades Poland. England declares war on Germany, and World War II begins. And the neutrality acts are implemented at this point, meaning that we're not supposed to trade with either Great Britain or Germany. So the U.S. position, what was it like back home? Well, there's popular sympathy for the Allies, meaning that people wanted the Allies to win. And the Allies at this point were England, France, and the Soviet Union. And remember, the U.S. has not recognized as legitimate the Soviet Union yet. But England, France, and the Soviet Union make up the Allies. They're the Axis, which is, Germany, Japan, and Italy. So really in the eyes of the United States and in most of the United States and Western Europe, this is the enemy, Germany, Japan, and Italy. Roosevelt, trying to stay out of it, trying not to, be too obvious in his choice of whose sides he's taken, but he tentatively supports the Allies. He talks about supporting the Allies in general terms, protecting democracy, to protecting the traditional Western civilization, Western European power structure, things like that. Then in 1939, as the war begins and Germany is successful, and obviously Great Britain and France need help, the U.S. implements something called the cash and carry policy as a way to help the Allies, but in a really a way to circumvent the neutrality acts. Basically, it's not loaning them money and we're not shipping goods to them, but we decided that it doesn't violate the neutrality acts if we do something called cash and carry, which means that whoever we're trading with, say Great Britain or England, we will sell them goods. We will supply. They have to bring their ships to our ports. They have to pay cash. They get no credit or no loans. They have to pay cash, and then they have to carry the goods on their ships. So it doesn't threaten our shipping and our ships. Very shortly after invading France, France crumbles, and Germany will occupy France for the remaining part of the war until the very end, when they're finally pushed out of France. And when that happens, it really does spur a lot of American concern that we should get into the war. Now, there was a handful, I won't say a handful, there's a pretty significant group of Americans that did not want to get involved in the war. Many of them were just pacifists that didn't believe in war at all. Many of them thought that that this World War II was too dangerous and it just wasn't worth it. And some of them, even though they wouldn't say it publicly, supported Hitler. And they believed in Hitler's policies of Aryan supremacy and blaming the Jews for the Depression and all kinds of other problems. these groups kind of together formed the America First Committee. The America First Committee was basically a committee formed, a group that wanted to keep the United States out of the war. And as I mentioned, many of them were, a chunk of them were pro-Hitler, but as I said, they didn't come out and say it. There were some pretty significant names as part of the America First Committee. One of the most famous names was Lindbergh, was a member of the America First Committee. So we're remaining neutral, and then, but we know that it's really getting bad, especially the fact that right now, 1939, 1940, really England is the only country that has the wherewithal to stop Germany's westward movement on the Western Front, and of course Russia is fighting by itself on the Eastern Front, which we'll see maps here in just a little bit. But we realize that eventually we might have to go to war, so we begin preparing for that potential eventuality. We see a dramatic increase in military spending, bulking up of military supplies, planes, ships, weapons, and we implement the draft. The United States implements the draft even though we're not at war. It's in American history. It's the first peacetime draft where conscription is done. Conscription is just the draft. Conscription is done before the actual declaration of war. And, you know, as we're watching the Nazi war machine take over Europe, there's an eventual consensus in America, with a few exceptions, that a Nazi-controlled Europe would threaten all of Western civilization. It wouldn't take much for them to, if Hitler controlled Western Europe, to just cross the Atlantic and threaten the United States. So we're looking for more ways to help the Allies. Another one is Lend-Lease, is a way to work around the Neutrality Acts. So instead of selling allies, you know, goods or loaning them money, we will loan them ships. We will loan them things for or trade or lease. Oftentimes we might lease like a ship in return for an unpopulated tiny island somewhere. So they're looking for ways to kind of, if not avoid the spirit of the Neutrality Acts, at least get around the details of it. Eventually, the U.S. is told to shoot German submarines if they're threatening American merchant ships. And with all this going on, we still have the election of 1940. Now, if you remember, Roosevelt was first elected in 1932. He was reelected in 1936. And now, throughout American history up to this point, every single president in American history who had served 2 terms chose not to run for a 3rd term. Franklin Roosevelt will break this streak. He'll be the first president to run for a 3rd consecutive term in office. And basically his argument is we're in the middle of 2 major crises. You still have the Great Depression going on, and we have war in Europe. And we don't need to change leadership in the middle of these crises. And the American public agreed with him and reelected him pretty handily in the popular vote and in the electoral vote, defeating Republican Wendell Willkie. Then we have problems that are manifesting themselves in Japan and in the Pacific Ocean. Japan has become more aggressive. If you remember, they invaded China and now occupy most of coastal China. Of course, if you occupy the coast, you control the inland, because if you occupy the coast, you occupy the ports where all goods are brought in. Therefore, you control what is sent inland. So in response, the U.S. limits export of strategic material to Japan, mainly oil. Remember, Japan doesn't have its own oil, and that they import most all of it, well, not most all of it, but a lot of it from the United States. So we cut off their oil. 1940, Japan allies itself with Germany and Italy as part of the Axis, so they're becoming much more aggressive, and their intent, especially with Germany and Italy already at war, their intent to also continue their war efforts Of course, we're thinking, the Americans are thinking they're just going to stay in Asia and, continue to invade the Asian territories that they already done with Korea and Indochina. Because once they invade Indochina, they basically are controlling most of the Asian coast. Now, Indochina, we'll hear more about that later in the next unit, because basically Indochina is a French colonial possession that consists of 3 separate countries that will become, once World War II ends, will become independent as the French Empire falls. And that would be not Colombia. The Indochina includes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So once they invade Indochina, the U.S. stops all trade with Japan. And so in 1941, the U.S. and Japan enter negotiations to try to, stop this rising tension between the two nations. Of course, both sides demand something that the other isn't willing to provide. So it's just a kind of a dog and pony show, if you will, with regard to these negotiations. But Japan demands a free hand in China, which means let us invade China and control China, which the United States is not going to do because it's going to violate the Open Door Agreement. And then normalization of relations, meaning basically they want the U.S. to start selling them oil and everything else again. And of course, the U.S. refuses to do both. They actually demand that Japan completely leave China. So this is the state of the negotiations. Pretty tense, not going anywhere. When, surprising most people, December 7th, 1941, Japan decides to attack Pearl Harbor Naval Station in Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean. It's a surprise attack. A large chunk of the U.S. Pacific Naval Fleet is docked at Pearl Harbor, and much of it is destroyed, planes and ships. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor successfully. The next day, the U.S. declares war on Japan. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt he has 2 really famous speech lines. The first one is this one, where he tells the country, what we talked about in the during the Great Depression, during his inauguration, he said, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself." Of course, when he declares war on Japan, he states that December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. And so the U.S. declares war on Japan. And I believe it's 2 or 3 days later that Germany considers, because Japan has allied themselves with Germany and Italy, Germany declares war on the United States because the U.S. declared war on Japan.